I always kept my study locked, a sanctuary of secrets and passions. My daughter, Sarah, was never allowed inside. But when she fell for a man who started asking too many questions about my books, I knew it was time to act. I installed hidden cameras throughout the house, anticipating the moment the truth would come to light. My name is Arthur. I'm 72 years old, and I live in a charming colonial-style house in Charleston, South Carolina, a home my late wife Clara and I bought 45 years ago when we were young and full of dreams. Clara left us 8 years ago after a brave battle with heart disease. She was only 64. We had so many plans, and her passing left a void that never quite filled. Our daughter Sarah was 25 when her mother passed away, fresh out of college and starting her career as an interior designer. People didn't quite understand that job back then. But now at 33, Sarah has built a respectable clientele and an enviable portfolio. She earns about $5,000 a month, which doesn't make her rich, but it's honest work, and she loves it. I raised Sarah to be independent and practical. After Clara died, Sarah rented her own apartment in downtown Charleston, paid her own bills, and built her own life. I was proud of that. She'd visit every Saturday for dinner, and we'd talk about her work, her friends, her life. She dated casually over the years, nothing serious. She seemed content, focused on building her career, and enjoying her early 30s. Then she met David. It was at an art and design event for young professionals. David was there, presenting himself as a promising software developer, and Sarah was immediately taken with him. He was 36, handsome in that polished way that comes from expensive haircuts and gym memberships, and he had a confidence that Sarah found attractive. Within 3 weeks, they were dating exclusively. Within 2 months, Sarah was convinced he was different from anyone she'd dated before. I met David for the first time at a Saturday dinner at my house. He arrived wearing a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, and he carried himself like someone who'd never questioned his place in the world. He was polite, charming, even with a firm handshake and direct eye contact. But something about him felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced being likable rather than actually being likable. During dinner, he asked questions, not about Sarah, but about me, about my career, my retirement, my property. When I mentioned I'd been a professor of ancient history at the University of South Carolina for 38 years, his eyes lit up with what I initially thought was genuine interest. "Ancient history," he said. "That's fascinating. I bet you have quite the collection of books and artifacts." I kept my answer vague. "A few shelves worth. Occupational hazard." He pressed. "First editions, rare pieces. Those can be worth quite a bit from what I understand." Sarah laughed. "Dad's books are just books, David. He's not running an antique shop." I smiled and changed the subject, but I'd noticed the calculation in his eyes. The way he'd glanced around my home, assessing, measuring, the way he'd asked pointed questions about whether the house was paid off, whether I planned to downsize now that I was living alone. After dinner, as Sarah helped me clean up, and David excused himself to take a phone call, she mentioned that he was doing really well with his startup. "He's just secured venture capital funding," she said. "He's on track to be very successful." I asked what the startup did. Sarah hesitated. "It's kind of technical, something with artificial intelligence and logistics solutions. I don't totally understand it, but David is really passionate about it." That was the first red flag. Not that she didn't understand his business, but that after 2 months of dating, he apparently hadn't bothered to explain it in a way she could. David noticed the door to my study during that first visit. It was off the living room, always kept locked. He asked about it casually, and I gave him the same answer I'd always given Sarah since she was a child. "That's my private workspace. I keep it organized my own way. I prefer people don't go in there." Sarah had respected that boundary her entire life. She'd grown up knowing the study was Dad's space, and she'd never questioned it. David, however, looked at that locked door like it was a puzzle he needed to solve. Over the next few months, I watched their relationship develop with growing unease. Sarah was happy, or at least she seemed happy, but there were small things that bothered me. David would make comments about her apartment being small or her car being old. He'd talk about the lifestyle they'd have together once his startup took off, about the house they'd buy, the vacations they'd take. Sarah would smile, but I could see the slight tension in her shoulders the way she changed the subject. I did what any concerned parent would do. I hired a private investigator. His name was Sam Miller, a former Charleston PD detective who'd gone private 5 years earlier. I gave him David's full name, David Alexander Sterling, and asked him to do a background check. The report came back 2.5 weeks later, and it was worse than I'd feared. David was not, in fact, running a successful tech startup. The venture capital funding didn't exist. What did exist was a pattern. David had been engaged twice before, both times to women with successful careers or family money. The first was a 38-year-old lawyer in Atlanta. David had convinced her to add him to her law firm's business account for administrative purposes, then systematically drained $55,000 before she discovered it. She'd pressed charges, but he'd paid restitution and avoided jail time. The second was a real estate agent in Miami. He'd gotten her to co-sign on a luxury car lease in a high-end apartment, then abandoned her with the debt when he moved back to South Carolina. She'd filed a lawsuit, but he'd declared bankruptcy and she'd never recovered the money. Sarah, Sam's report suggested, was David's third target, but Sarah herself wasn't wealthy. Sam's assessment was that David was betting on me, on whatever inheritance Sarah might eventually receive. The questions about my books, my house, my finances, they all made sense now. I didn't tell Sarah about the investigation immediately. I knew she wouldn't believe me. She was in love, or what she thought was love, and any criticism would only push her away. I'd seen it happen to other parents. The more they pushed against an unsuitable partner, the harder their children clung to them. So I waited and I watched and I prepared. 6 months into their relationship, Sarah called me with news. They were getting engaged. David had proposed at a rooftop restaurant overlooking Charleston Harbor. Very public, very Instagram-worthy. Sarah was crying happy tears on the phone, and I congratulated her, told her I was thrilled for her, told her all the things a father is supposed to say. What else could I do? The engagement party was held at a trendy venue in downtown Charleston. David had chosen it. The cost was $18,000, split between both families, though David's contribution came almost entirely from a credit card. According to my discreet inquiries, his parents, I learned, lived in Orlando and were not wealthy. His father was a retired teacher, his mother a librarian. They were good people by all accounts, baffled by their son's expensive lifestyle and apparent success. At the engagement party, I met some of David's friends. They were a specific type, the kind of people who talked constantly about investments and opportunities and disruption. When I mentioned I was a retired history professor, one of them actually said, "Oh, so not really a business background then?" I smiled. No, not really. David introduced me to people as Sarah's father. He has quite the book and artifact collection. Each time he said it, I noticed the slight emphasis, like he was testing how people reacted, gauging interest. The wedding planning that followed was a nightmare. David wanted everything lavish. A venue at a boutique winery in Greenville that cost $70,000, a photographer package for $30,000, a dress from a designer boutique that cost $20,000. The total budget climbed toward $220,000. Sarah was stressed. I could see it every time we talked. She'd taken out a small loan. She was doing extra sponsored posts, working weekends, barely sleeping. David, meanwhile, seemed energized by the planning, always posting on social media about their forever journey, tagging luxury brands, building an audience for their wedding content. I contributed $30,000 toward the wedding. It hurt to do it, knowing where the money was really going, but I couldn't watch my daughter destroy herself financially. David thanked me politely, then immediately started discussing the honeymoon. He wanted the Maldives, another $35,000 Sarah didn't have. During this time, David started visiting my house more frequently. He'd come with Sarah for Saturday dinners, but he'd arrive early or stay late, always finding reasons to linger. He'd ask about the house. When had I bought it? What was it worth now? Had I considered selling and moving into something more manageable? One Saturday afternoon, Sarah had to leave early for a work call with a brand sponsor. David offered to stay and help me clean up. I agreed, curious what he was planning. After Sarah left, he made his move. He was subtle about it, more subtle than I'd seen in other stories, but the intent was the same. "Arthur," he said, loading the dishwasher with studied casualness. "Sarah and I have been talking about our future. We're thinking about buying a house after the wedding. Something in Mount Pleasant or Daniel Island, you know, with good light for her content creation and space for my home office. But the housing market in Charleston is insane right now." I nodded, wiping down the counters. "We were wondering," he continued, "have you thought about downsizing? This house is pretty big for one person. You could sell it, move into a condo downtown, something modern with less maintenance, and maybe help us with a down payment. Think of it as an early inheritance. You'd be setting Sarah up for success." I turned to face him, taking my time, drying my hands. "I appreciate your concern, David, but I'm quite comfortable here. Clara and I built our life in this house. I'm not ready to leave." His smile tightened slightly. "Of course I understand. I just thought family helps family, right? And Sarah's really struggling with all these wedding costs." "Sarah's an adult," I said calmly. "She makes her own choices. If the wedding's too expensive, you two can always scale back. Maybe something simpler, more intimate." His eyes flashed with something cold for just a second before the charming mask returned. "Scale back? This is the most important day of our lives, Arthur. This is Sarah's dream wedding. Don't you want your daughter to be happy?" "I want my daughter to be financially secure," I replied. "There's a difference." He left soon after, and I could tell I'd become a problem for him. The friendly future son-in-law act had cracked enough for me to see what lay beneath. The next day, Sarah called me. She was upset. David had told her I'd been dismissive of their wedding plans, that I'd suggested they have a cheap ceremony. I explained what had actually been said, but Sarah was torn between us now, torn between her father and her fiancé. We had a tense conversation that ended with both of us frustrated. That's when things started to escalate. David began asking Sarah more direct questions about my background. Had I inherited money? Did I have investments? What about life insurance? Sarah, uncomfortable with the interrogation, mentioned this to me during one of our Saturday dinners when David wasn't there. "He keeps asking about your finances, Dad. I don't know why it matters so much to him." "Perhaps he's concerned about your future security," I said, though we both knew that wasn't it. Then David started digging. I know this because Sarah's friend Emily, who was more perceptive than Sarah gave her credit for, mentioned seeing David at the Charleston Public Library downtown, poring over old University of South Carolina faculty directories and academic journals. He was looking for information about me, about my career, about anything that might hint at hidden wealth. What David didn't know was what was actually in my study. For 47 years, since I was 25 and just starting my doctoral program, I had been collecting rare artifacts and books. Not just any books, but first editions, signed copies, manuscripts, letters, the kind of historical and literary treasures most people don't even know exist. I had an Egyptian papyrus from the Book of the Dead, dated 1500 BC, which I bought at an auction in 1990 for $50,000, now worth approximately $500,000. I had a first edition of On the Origin of Species, signed by Charles Darwin, a first edition of Cervantes' Don Quixote, a 1570 world map by Abraham Ortelius in near-perfect condition, a complete set of first editions of Jane Austen's novels, several of them signed, and dozens of other treasures accumulated over 4 decades of careful collecting. My most valuable possession was a handwritten letter from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton, dated 1788, which I bought at auction in 1998 for $120,000. It was now appraised at $700,000. In total, my collection was worth approximately $3.2 million. Clara knew about the collection, of course. She helped me research values, find auction houses, plan purchases. After she died, the collection became even more important to me. These items weren't just investments. They were my passion, my life's work, the physical manifestation of everything I had studied and taught for nearly 4 decades. Sarah knew I collected books and artifacts, but she thought it was just a hobby. She saw me buy items at estate sales and antique shops, but she had no idea of their value. I planned to tell her eventually when she was older, more settled, more prepared to understand the responsibility that came with such wealth. David's arrival had changed my timeline. 3 months before the wedding, I made a decision. I installed security cameras throughout my house, not just in the study, but in all common areas. Motion-activated, infrared, recording to a cloud server, accessible from my phone. I also upgraded the lock on my study door to a smart lock with a 6-digit code only I knew. Sarah noticed the cameras when she visited 2 weeks later. "New security system, Dad. There have been some break-ins in the neighborhood." I said that was partly true. There had been a robbery 4 blocks away. Just being cautious. David noticed it too. I saw him looking at the cameras, calculating angles, assessing coverage. I asked if they recorded continuously, or only when triggered. I told him continuously, though they were actually motion-activated. I wanted him to think he was being watched more closely than he actually was. The wedding was approaching. Sarah looked exhausted every time I saw her. She had lost weight, had dark circles under her eyes. David, meanwhile, seemed energized, constantly posting on social media about their forever journey, tagging luxury brands, building an audience for their wedding content. Then, 2 weeks before the wedding, David brought someone to Saturday dinner. His name was Thomas, supposedly an old college friend. Thomas asked many questions about my career, about my collection of books and artifacts, about what kinds of items I had. He mentioned he'd done some rare book appraisal work and would love to take a look at my collection sometime. I politely declined, but I knew what Thomas really was, an appraiser. David was trying to find out what I had through an intermediary. After they left, I reviewed the camera footage from dinner. At one point, while Sarah and I were in the kitchen, David had led Thomas to my study door. They examined the lock, and Thomas took pictures of it with his phone. They were planning something. I called Samuel Miller again. I asked him to do a deeper dive into David, specifically to look for any connections to theft, fraud, or property crimes. The report came back 4 days later. David had an arrest record I didn't know about. 10 years ago, when he was 26, he'd been arrested for trespassing at his ex-girlfriend's apartment. He claimed he was just retrieving his belongings and the charges were dropped, but it was there on the record. I now had proof of intent and a pattern of behavior. I also had cameras recording everything. All I needed was for David to make his move. The alert came at 3:27 a.m. on a Wednesday, 10 days before the wedding. Motion detected, study door. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera feed. David was there. He was wearing dark clothes and gloves. He was trying codes on the keypad, systematically, starting with obvious combinations, birthdays, addresses, years. I watched him for 9 minutes. He tried 52 different combinations. He couldn't get in. The lock held. Eventually, he gave up, looked around nervously, and left. I had it all on video. Crystal clear. Infrared images showing his face, his actions, the timestamp, but I didn't confront him that night. I waited. The next morning, I called Sarah. "Can you come over today? It's important. Come alone." She arrived that afternoon, worried. "Dad, what's wrong? You sounded serious." I opened the video on my tablet. "I need you to watch something." Sarah's face went through a progression of emotions as she watched. Confusion first, then disbelief, then anger, then hurt. When the video ended, she was silent for a long moment. "Why would he do that?" She started, then stopped. "What's in the study, Dad?" I took a deep breath. It was time. "Come with me." We walked to the study. I entered the code, disengaged the smart lock, and opened the door for the first time in Sarah's presence since she was a small child. The study was not large, maybe 12x14 ft, but every wall was lined floor to ceiling with custom-built, climate-controlled shelving. The books and artifacts were arranged by era and author, each one protected in archival quality sleeves. Soft LED lighting illuminated the spines. Sarah gasped. I showed her the Egyptian papyrus, the green cloth binding with golden hieroglyphs. Darwin's signature on the title page in fading ink. I showed her the Washington letter, the Ortelius map in its protective case, the Austin collection. I explained what each was worth, how I'd acquired it, why it mattered. "Dad," she whispered, touching the sleeve, protecting the papyrus with trembling fingers. How much is all of this worth?" "About $3.2 million, give or take, depending on the market. Some pieces are harder to value. The Washington letter, for instance, is essentially priceless because of its rarity." Sarah sat down in my reading chair, the leather wingback where I spent my evenings. $3.2 million, and you never told me. I was waiting for the right time. I wanted you to be older, more settled. I didn't want the knowledge of this wealth to change you, to make you a target. Clara and I agreed when you were young that we'd tell you eventually, but after she died I became even more protective. Maybe too protective. Does anyone else know? My lawyer knows. My insurance company knows. That's it. I kept it secret because I didn't want you to become what David was looking for. Someone with access to family money. Sarah looked at the video on my phone again, her fiancé trying to break into this room. He was looking for this. He suspected I had something valuable. He's been researching me, bringing appraisers here, asking questions, the expensive wedding, the pressure to sell the house. It was all about accessing what he thought was here. Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky. "I've been so stupid. You've been in love, or what you thought was love. But love doesn't do this, Sarah. Love doesn't try to break into your father's private space at 3 a.m. Love doesn't push you into debt for a wedding you can't afford. Love doesn't calculate and scheme." Sarah pulled out her phone. She stared at it for a moment, then made the call. I stepped out of the study to give her privacy. Through the door I could hear her voice, calm at first, then rising in anger. The conversation lasted 28 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her expression was determined. He denied it at first. Then when I told him I'd seen the video, he got angry. He said I was too influenced by you, that I was choosing you over him. He said I'd never amount to anything with my little internet job. He actually said that. She laughed bitterly. 2 years. I wasted 2 years on someone who just saw me as a payday. I pulled her into a hug. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know this hurts. He never loved me at all, did he? I don't think he knows how to love anyone except himself." Over the next few days, Sarah handled the aftermath. The wedding was canceled. They lost some deposits, but it was a fraction of what the full wedding would have cost. David moved out of Sarah's apartment. He'd apparently had a key made without asking and had been slowly moving his things in. Sarah changed her locks. His true colors emerged fully in the following week. He posted on social media about being betrayed by someone from a wealthy family who kept secrets. He tried to spin it like Sarah and I had deceived him. Some of his followers bought it, but Sarah's friends knew the truth, and the narrative didn't last long. The worst moment came when David showed up at my house 4 days after the breakup. Sarah wasn't there. He rang the doorbell at 7:45 on a Sunday morning. "I know what you have," he said through the door. "Sarah told me about the books. You owe me. I spent 2 years on her. I invested in that relationship." I called the police. They arrived within 12 minutes and escorted him away with a warning about trespassing. I haven't seen him since, though Sarah told me he moved back to Orlando about 3 weeks later. Sarah spent the next month recovering. She threw herself into her work, reconnected with friends she'd neglected during the relationship, and came over for Saturday dinners every single week. She was hurt, but she was healing. 6 weeks after the canceled wedding, something unexpected happened. Sarah had been invited to tour the Charleston Art Museum's new literary exhibition, a collection of famous authors' manuscripts and letters on loan from various collections. She asked if I wanted to come with her. At the exhibition, we met the curator, a man named Ethan Hayes, 35 years old, originally from Savannah. He was a rare book and artifact specialist with a master's degree in archival sciences, and he clearly loved his work. When he learned I was a retired history professor with an interest in rare books, he engaged me in a genuine conversation about historical preservation, the ethics of private collecting versus public access, and the joy of connecting people with literature. Sarah and Ethan talked for nearly an hour after the tour ended. He asked about her work, seemed genuinely interested in the creative aspects of interior design, and never once asked about finances or family money. When he learned she was recovering from a difficult breakup, he was sympathetic without being pushy. He asked if she'd like to get coffee sometime. She said yes. That was 4 months ago. Sarah and Ethan have been dating since then, taking it slow, building something real. He knows about my book collection now, Sarah told him after 7 weeks of dating. When she felt confident in his character, his reaction was perfect. He was amazed by the collection, asked intelligent questions about preservation and acquisition, but he wasn't interested in the monetary value. He saw what I saw, 47 years of passion and dedication to history and literature. Last Saturday, Ethan and Sarah came over for dinner. Afterward, we went to the study together. Ethan examined the books with the care and reverence of someone who understood what they represented. "These are extraordinary, Professor," he said, carefully viewing the Washington letter through its protective case. "But you know what's more extraordinary? That you built a career teaching students to love history while building this collection. That you passed that love of books to your daughter. That's a legacy that goes beyond monetary value." Sarah squeezed his hand and smiled at me. I realized in that moment that the real legacy was never the books. It was the values I'd passed down, the importance of character, of patience, of choosing people for who they are rather than what they have. The books will go to Sarah someday. Maybe she'll keep them. Maybe she'll donate some to a museum. Maybe she'll sell a few to fund her future. It doesn't matter. What matters is that she learned the lessons she needed to learn. She learned to recognize manipulation. She learned that her worth isn't determined by someone else's opinion of her career or her prospects. She learned that real love looks like Ethan asking thoughtful questions and respecting boundaries, not like David, calculating and scheming. I never allowed my daughter to enter the study because I was trying to protect her from the burden of wealth, from becoming a target. Looking back, maybe I should have trusted her with the truth earlier. Maybe the secrecy made her vulnerable because she never learned to recognize people who saw her as a means to an end. But you do your best as a parent, make mistakes, and hope your children forgive you and grow from the experience. Sarah forgave me more than that. She understood. And together we built something better than what I'd planned. Not just an inheritance of wealth, but an inheritance of wisdom. The study is no longer a secret between us. The cameras are still there. I kept those. But now, Sarah knows the code. She comes and goes as she pleases, often bringing Ethan to sit among the books and talk about history, literature, and their life and future together. They're planning a small wedding for next spring. The budget is $15,000, and they're paying for it themselves. They don't want my money. They want my blessing. They have it completely. Sometimes on Saturday evenings, the three of us sit in the study drinking tea and talking about books. The Egyptian papyrus gleams under the soft lighting. The Washington letter rests in its protective case. The first edition of Darwin, which Ethan is helping me prepare for a museum loan, sits carefully wrapped on my desk. These books are worth millions. But sitting here with my daughter and the man who truly loves her, surrounded by the work of my lifetime, I realized the real treasure was never on these shelves. It was in raising a daughter who could learn from her mistakes, who could recognize real love when she found it, who could appreciate legacy without being corrupted by it, who could understand that protecting someone isn't the same as preparing them. David tried to steal from us. He tried to manipulate, to deceive, to take what we'd built over decades. But in the end, he gave us something instead. He gave Sarah clarity. He gave us a second chance to communicate honestly. He gave me the opportunity to teach the lessons I should have taught years ago. I installed cameras and upgraded locks to protect $3.2 million in rare books. But what I was really protecting was something far more valuable. The relationship between a father and daughter, the integrity of family, the chance to build something real based on trust and honesty. The study door is still locked at night. The cameras still record. But now there are 2 people who know the code. Soon to be 3 when Ethan officially becomes part of the family. Father, daughter, and someone who sees her for who she truly is. That's the story of how I almost lost my daughter to someone who saw her as a means to an end, and how a collection of rare books saved our relationship. Not because of their value, but because they forced us to have the conversations we should have had years ago. Because they revealed David's true nature before it was too late. Because they taught Sarah that her worth isn't measured in dollars or followers or someone else's ambitions. I never allowed my daughter to enter the study until I did. And everything changed for the better. So, did you like today's story? If this narrative touched your heart or made you reflect, please leave your like. This greatly helps the channel continue bringing new stories to you. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episodes. And tell me in the comments, which state are you speaking from right now? I love to know where you're joining me from. Thank you for your company. See you in the next story.